welcome everybody to our second colloquium of our 50th anniversary series this year, which is focused on alumni working out of state and in some cases out of the country to see what folks are doing after they leave our Storrs Hall and leave our campus and forge remarkable careers like that of Jeffrey Ludlow. And I'll just say these have been really exciting for me as the still relatively new director to the school to learn more about past activities, past relationships of professors and students, and how those influences continue in the work of our fabulous alumni. So I'll before I hand it off to Peter, I'll just say I will need to jump out at 1:30 for an AIA board meeting, but really look forward to seeing the work, and will allow Peter, as one of the co-curators of this year's series, along with Caddy, give the introduction.
Great, thank you, Blaine. Welcome everybody to our second colloquium for the year. We actually have we'll be having a total of 8 colloquiums this year, and so the next one will be with Christine Abbott coming up in the latter part of October. And also just an announcement, our next lecturer will be Felicia Davis for the lecture series, so please watch for that coming up soon. Well, it's wonderful to have another one of our distinguished alums, Jeffrey Ludlow, here to give a presentation of some of the things he's been doing since he graduated from the College of Architecture. I think it was at that time. Now the School of Architecture. He graduated in 2001. After that, he received his Master's of Architecture degree in 2003 from SciArc in Los Angeles. And for the past 15 years, his work has been at the intersection of the worlds of architecture, commerce, and culture, where he has worked with leaders such as Rem Koolhaas, Kanye West, Miuccia Prada, and his design initiatives and branding strategies has contributed to the cultural directives of institutions such as the Centro Botín and the Victoria and Albert Museum, as well as companies including Apple, Audi, Nike, and Prada. Previously, he was a chief creative officer at Bruce Mau Design, and he worked for 11 years at the graphic design agency 2x4, where he was creative director on some very, very important projects with architects. And since 2019, Jeffrey has been the leader of his own creative practice in Madrid, Spain, named Point of Reference. And I think he's going to share with some of his recent work with us today. And the studio, his graphic studio, design studio, is dedicated towards integrating ideas, graphic design, and architecture. Jeffrey is also a teacher and instructs design courses at the IE School of Architecture and Design in Madrid, as well as lectured at universities and conferences worldwide. It's our great pleasure to welcome Jeffrey back to the school.
Thank you for having me. Let me quickly share my screen. All right. I'd first like to sort of thank you for having me back. Thanks, Peter, for the invitation in the School of Architecture. To be a returning alumni of the class of 2001 and to be asked to speak is both an honor and somewhat particular in my case. For one, it kind of really does show how much you've aged in 20 years. But two, it's something that a type of lecture like this that really asks you, what have you done of significance with your career in the past 20 years? And I think that is, it's kind of started going back and forth. But I think what I would like to do is to talk a little bit about that and why that's a little bit difficult for me to talk about, because in the past 20 years, I've really made a career of avoiding architecture and have always kind of sort of been somewhat architecturally adjacent. And so I would like to start this talk with a professional recap of where I last left off, where last time I saw you and last time I was in stores. And I would like to do that not so much as sort of a glorification of me or my path, but really to illustrate to any student sitting out there that if you're enjoying what you're learning in school now, it doesn't necessarily need to be applied to a traditional architecture path. There is architectural process without buildings. And so I would love to sort of show this a little bit somewhat circuitous path that I took just to sort of understand a little bit of where I was and where I am now. I graduated in 2001, and I think when I left UNCC, I felt really confident that I could draw, I could model, I could make a solid chair in the wood shop, and I could diagram and build narratives for presentations after having done a thesis. And in my mind, I was ready, to enter the architectural profession and to begin designing from the get-go. But reality kind of sort of set in, and I spent a year out as essentially kind of a glorified draftsman of interiors in a mid-size firm. It felt a little bit somewhat like a cog in a machine and a tall ladder, to climb to get anywhere close to really a design position. And I guess my impatience kind of sort of pushed me to enroll to sort of graduate school to see what else existed, to revise my perspective. But after graduating from SciArc, I decided to look for employment in offices that were strictly multidisciplinary and that were heavily invested in cultural strategy and design, or what at the time I called Architecture Plus. And my first sort of job out of school was working at OMA Rotterdam. And that was largely part of because the combination of sort of model making skills and presentations, it squarely landed me in the competition team. And it was really there at OMA that it was the first time that I was able to see a large variety of non-architectural professions integrate into an office. It was the first time glimpsing the world of sort of sub-consultancy, where at OMA, a sub-consultant was essentially a rock star because everyone else in the building was an architect. From there, after leaving the Netherlands, I worked in a variety of places, always kind of started improving my design sensibility. And during this period, I created some of my first books, exhibitions, signage, all for sort of architectural companies. And not too long afterwards, I landed back within the OMA constellation of sort of sub-consultants and started working at 2x4 Inc. And for the next 11 years, I would lead a small design teams in both Beijing, New York, and Europe on a wide range of projects, from interiors to print projects to branding to art direction, etc. And I became the first non-graphic designer to become an art director in the firm's history. And at 2x4, one of the things that I enjoyed most was this vast scale changes that we would be working on. Simultaneously, I was working on one of the largest projects in the world, a new pyramid of media. and the smallest, which was the age-old question of how to get a boat in a perfume bottle. After 11 rich years at 2x4, I continue my journey at Bruce Mao Design, where I continue to absorb more experiences and skills around the world of sort of branding and placemaking. And then to what is now today, sort of having my own independent small practice. This kind of sort of overall sort of sequence of events is easy to tell, but it's a little bit more complicated because this happened in 5 countries, 10 cities. And there was a variety of sort of titles that mattered little to me, but allowed me to amass a wealth of sort of experiences of different types of disciplines, of different types of things, etc. And so even though I've had no building to my portfolio thus far, I've kind of amassed a certain amount of experiences that make me what some people might call a sort of multidisciplinary designer. And in that sort of 10 years, I've been able to make everything from identity systems to place branding, to print, to websites, to motion and exhibitions, retail spaces, and signage systems. I've been able to work not only alongside some of the world's best architects, but also in a wide range of corporations spanning from music, fashion, technology, culture, etc. And although it sounds very exciting working in this kind of sort of multidisciplinary sort of fashion, it sounds kind of dynamic, as if the ground is always changing, it does require a few key grounding aspects that it's worthwhile to know if you're interested in a similar path, or if not, it's just generally good design advice. The first aspect is that in order to accept that, you have to accept that you're not the master of all the mediums and disciplines, because that takes time, but you need to be able to think in systems and understand that systematic thinking is heavily underpinned by strategy, and where the strategy is the big idea. The second is that as an external agency, regardless if you arrive through the marketing department door or hand in hand with the CEO, your idea needs to have clarity to navigate both up and down the hierarchies and politics of corporations and offices. The simpler, the stickier the idea, the further it travels, and the higher the success rate of it becoming a reality. And lastly, that context is everything, whether it's architectural, professional, or historical context, you're constantly responding within a context or rebelling against it. So after many years of working for other people as what some people might describe as a multidisciplinary designer, I've opened up my own independent studio in Madrid, what is called Point of Reference, or POR, which is a bilingual name that also means four in Spanish. And rather than provide this large, complex array of services to a lot of different clients and a lot of different sectors, POR is really focused on offering a select set of services to a select set of clients. In a way, we're trying to be less multidisciplinary and being more interdisciplinary, where we just want to be between the overlap of what is sort of graphic design and architecture. And the majority of clients are in some way somewhat creatively related, whether they're architects, urbanists, landscape designers, industrial designers, gallery, or artists. The one thing that we still do keep in common between what we used to do and what we're doing now is we still do enjoy working at any scale. So that is a point of reference. And what I wanted to do is to show 3 projects from point of reference that kind of quickly illustrate those ideas of thinking in systems, clarity, brutal clarity, and sort of the importance of context. The first project that I wanted to show is a project for IE University where I teach. And if you don't know IE, it's a university based in Madrid, Spain. It's a very well-known sort of business school, but within the university, there is also an architecture and design school that's headed up by Martha Thorne, who, if you don't know who Martha Thorne is, she also happens to be, besides being the head of the school, she has a side hustle as a sort of executive director of the Pritzker Prize, which means that the lecture series at IE is a Pritzker Prize lineup. But in the years past, even though Martha has the ability to bring in big names to the school, the lecture series were poorly communicated to a larger audience outside of the school, especially when you look at sort of the long history of sort of well-known designers in architecture departments. And so we were tasked to design both the posters, the posts, the motion graphics for the lecture series. And we've been doing that for the past 4 years. But what I'll be showing today is really the past 3 years because I can't show this year's quite yet. I'll be showing them simultaneously from 2018, 2019, and 2020. And we always start the process with either an image or a text from Martha that encapsulates sort of the lecture series itself, where we then take that within sort of the team in a team of sort of 4 to 5 designers and begin to create explorations and options on how to best express that theme or text. And from those, we usually land on one key concept that works really well, one for the theme, but also for the adaptability to be able to go across various mediums in terms of poster sizes, but also print, but also social media. So in 2018, it was nesting. 2019 was really blur and reveal. 2020 was the grid. And each one of these concepts is something that we never think in static only, but also in motion. And they have to communicate the individual lectures as well as the overall lecture series. When we first started this in 2018, the first lecture series was called Powers of 10, very much sort of based on sort of the Eames film, where we reinterpret this to be really the nesting of information, the nesting of all the different sort of lectures. This particular year was nominated for a Laus Prize in Spain and was actually voted by to be the best poster and architizer. The second year, we worked on the concept of blurring and revealing, where the concept was partly a response to all the speakers sending us low-res LinkedIn profiles that we had to blow up. So we had no other option than to blur. And the last year, 2020, we explored the idea of using the grid to create a custom typography, but also a series of sort of shapes that are sort of created within sort of the grid. But then we incorporated sort of the school facilities and got to use the laser cutter to actually sort of cut the holes in the grid in the actual poster. And our work on sort of the lecture series, even though it started on some very simple sort of posters ideas, we're now sort of expanding. We've kind of expanded to worked with the marketing department of the university, and it's now expanding into other branches and schools at IE. The next project that I want to show you is a new project that we recently completed for a Spanish industrial designer named Álvaro Catalán de Ocon, who back in 2010 designed a lamp from a plastic bottle that incorporated regional weaving techniques, and that in the past 10 years, he and his team have traveled the world to find various weaving communities to partner up with, both economically and design-wise. And they now have 8 communities spanning 5 continents creating these lamps. And they have 8 lines of these lamps, which each line contains a variety of sizes from small to medium to extra large that can all be combined in different sets, which makes this kind of very simple story of a bottle turning into a lamp a very complex consumer story of how to select the lamp. There's an infinite amount of choices, and no individual lamp shade is alike to any other. Each one is unique. We started the project with revisiting the identity. This is sort of the current identity and colors. And for a product that is not cheap, each sort of lamp can cost anywhere from $300 to $5,000, depending on sort of the quantity and set. We felt that this identity felt somewhat naive, a little bit clumsy, and not as sophisticated as it should be to match the price point of that particular product. And we also needed this identity to somehow pair well with the current identity of sort of Álvaro Studio that we had done 7 years ago. So it was a month-long process working with Álvaro and his team to get to something that retained this idea of sort of weaving, but in a not so playful and naive way. And what resulted was a more sophisticated identity that felt lighter and that could more the cables of sort of the hanging lamps more than the shades themselves. And that then paired well with sort of the typefaces that we already had for Álvaro Studio's brand. And that from there, that we could then layer in colors that instead of just being colorful could be coded to talk about 2 particular themes which are important to the project. One is the environment and the other is the social. And so these are some of the pieces where you begin to see it all come together. The identity, the typefaces, the colors, the themes. And for the website, this was their previous website. And this is the essentially the web architecture of that website. And it was more focused on telling a lengthy and unedited story of the lamp and the regional process of each country and region. And it felt as if the story in the old website was really from the perspective of the designer rather than the consumer. And so what we did is we proposed a more a structure sort of focused on what the client needed to see, meaning that they usually would buy a lamp if they saw an attractive image, and then little by little we would layer in information about the different lines, about the regions, about the traditional techniques, about the mission of the overall brand. And we layer that in a way that we always discussed it in 3 parts: attract, engage, and connect. So we're going from less information to more information. This is sort of the website itself. And that is a website that is currently up and working if you are interested in pet lamps. And the next and last project I want to talk about is Centro Botín. Centro Botín is an international cultural center in Santander, Spain, that is sponsored by the Botín family of Santander Bank. And we originally came on this project when it was a competition. We were shortlisted to participate in this competition. And what we knew when we entered the competition was, one, that it was a Renzo piano building, that it had 2 floating volumes, and that on its facade, it was covered with these pearlescent sort of ceramic discs that reflected the surroundings. And strategically, we knew that all our fellow competitors would immediately grasp to the sort of low-hanging fruit of the circle. So in our proposal, we had a very lengthy explanation railing against circular symbols and illustrating how difficult it was to incorporate a circle in a very rectilinear world of sort of print and screens. And what we advocated for was a brand system rather than a brand symbol. A system that was flexible to meet the polyvalent programming of the center, but could also toggle to address local and international audiences. And rather than work with the circular disc, we focused on the void between the 2 floating volumes. A void that could hold and frame the family name, but also cut the 2 letters that are center and centro, the bilingual names for center. Those 2 parallel lines, or those cuts, activate these 2 parallel lines that begins a whole system that is about parallel lines acting as a vessel that could hold contents, whether it be text, pictures, pictograms, or even more discs. This is the identity. And this is sort of the system of the sort of 2 lines and how it works. And how that sort of system and identity begins to sort of irrigate both print, digital applications, and all touch points, even the gift shop or the cafe. And all of this culminated in what started off as a competition is 2 years of work to fill a brand manual, which was 300 pages that summed up how to use the brand across all touch points. One of those touch points that we worked on also exclusively was the signage. We did all the physical signage for the building, where we worked with Renzo Piano's office and the client to designate the building nomenclature, and created signage that adapted to the semi-industrial character of the building, but felt very integrated into the place. So signage was not a secondary afterthought. We also designed custom pictogram set that's evocative of sort of the building geometry. How it begins to disseminate through the space. And here you can begin to see, I have this small little arrow here pointing how our initial intention of rebelling against the circle worked really well, as there was a screen that was attached to the building, which perfectly held the logo. And in addition to that, there is a tunnel below the park that is connected to the building itself, that the majority of Santander's traffic has to go underneath. And below there, we were also able to place the logo itself. So everything that we rallied against and were strategic about worked really well. And after finishing the project and inaugurating the building, the client gave us a round ceramic tile with our rectilinear logo on it. And that's essentially how the project had come full circle, pun intended. So as you can see, these are considered the types of projects that we do. They operate at a lot of different sort of scales, a lot of different sort of services. One of the key things that I think we do really well at POR is we do a lot of signage and wayfinding. Part of that is we have sort of 15 years of experience working on high-end architectural projects at a complex level. There are not many people or studios who can say they've designed the signage and navigation for the two signature round buildings around, both CCTV and Apple Park. So we think it's really our sort of core strength, but it's also partly our obsession. We've been sort of collecting for the past 20 years a litany of sort of signage references, which we have been sort of putting together in the past sort of 2 years on sort of an Instagram channel, which is essentially kind of sort of opening up the vault. And we've also begun to start to do Instagram stories that really talk about sort of the relevance and sort of how signage is a silent reflection of our sort of culture. That sort of sums up where we are with sort of POR in terms sort of past, present, and future. I hope this has been sort of interesting, especially for any students out there who might be questioning a traditional sort of architectural path, that there is room to work within the profession with what you're learning in school, but it could also be used for other things. Thank you.
Very good, Jeffrey. That's really, really wonderful. It's nice to see the work of POR with respect to some of the earlier work that we know of and that you've introduced us to during our field excursions. This is great. This should be a discussion, and I know there are students and most likely faculty, namely probably Greg Snyder, who's bursting at the seams to ask you some questions. Can I just ask you one question though, as one of the coordinators? Sure. I think that the graphic urgency that we all have in our work, whether we do it directly as a professional or as amateurs, as architects, has entered a point where irony and the ability to kind of play fun with graphics is really important. And now working in Spain, in Madrid, and just kind of knowing that the culture, and of course I'm stereotyping a little bit, is a little more kind of sober with the way they address graphic information. How is the firm kind of breaking ground on a kind of lighter version of what graphic information can imply. I mean, I'm very interested in that kind of cultural relationship.
Well, I mean, I think there's two ways to sort of think about that, because there's the graphic design community here in Spain, and there's a lot of great, and there's a lot of talented graphic design agencies here, right? And there's the other one, which is more sort of the architectural or more spatially focused community. And I think they're somewhat on two different planes, where obviously the graphic designers, you know, who are more in tune to tone, typography, and other things can read between the lines, the irony. And I think sometimes the architects, there is, and I think this is also somewhat a difference between sort of graphic design and sort of architecture, is that I've always sort of thought that as an architect, I want to layer in more. As the graphic designer, I want to edit out, right? I think there's a less is more and there's a more is more. And so I think those are kind of sort of two differences in kind of sort of the education, if you will. I don't know if that sort of answered that, because there's a couple layers to that, to your question, sort of, Peter.
Yeah, no, I liked how you differentiated the graphic designer from the architect. I think it's really true.
Yeah.
But let me let the students, maybe some of the faculty, go ahead and post some questions. There's some bravos in the chat session from Chris Jarrett. Great stuff, says Ken Lambla. Wonderful to hear how your life has progressed since our dinner in Beijing. That was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions? Please turn on your mics and we can go live here.
Peter, I'll kind of ask a query. Hey, Jeff, I'm kind of curious if you can like characterize the difference in the buzz in working in this kind of world of kind of graphics, in contrast to the buzz or the delayed buzz working in the world of architecture. It seems like there's just a kind of a different speed in this kind of work, and maybe a different kind of pace of satisfaction in seeing things move compared to architecture. That may be kind of naive on my part, but I'm just curious about that.
No, I think that's an excellent question, because I think there is a difference not only in sort of scales, but also speeds. You know, like we finish on every year, we probably, when I look at the project numbers, like right now, we start every year with the new project number, and we're right now in sort of the 60s. So come sort of like since, so if you think about that, that's 60 projects that we are currently not working all at once, but we have finished since January. And so projects can be weeks, could be months. If we're doing a signage system, like right now we're working on a signage system for a university, that might be a year. So it's more connected to an architectural schedule. But there is I like the word buzz, because there is a certain sort of quality that you need to sort of get it out there and sort of get it out there quick, right? And I do think in a way, I think in conversations with other friends, you know, I often say this, is that graphic design is a little bit an odd profession, because it's almost like you cut hair. Someone will come in, you know, someone will ask for a haircut, and they might have a picture. They might say, I need this haircut, right? And you as a professional have to say, well, you know, that's not currently the fashion, or that's not currently the thing you could be doing, or it could be even more dramatic, and you need to say, well, you know, like, to be quite honest, your face is not going to match up with that style, right? And so there is this kind of subtlety that we have to work quick, but we also have to be able to convince people very quickly of ideas that are somewhat ethereal, like sure, there's brands and sort of logos and systems, and they kind of sort of last around, but not always.
Yeah.
So there is kind of like a buzz, but there's also a buzz kill.
I did want to mention for everybody else's kind of benefit, Jeff was also one of our traveling fellowship recipients. He went to Colombia to look at the work of Rogelio Salmona, who's, as it said, the Lucan of South America. So Jeff, I teach the materials class now. So Rogelio Salmona made an appearance today in brick masonry.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just a shout out, one more shout out.
Yeah, very nice.
Hey, Jeff, I had a question.
Sure.
I loved your lecture, and I think it was very, very well put together. And I love to see all of these different kind of alumni, because it gives me a lot of inspiration as a student. But what I'm interested in is this kind of like border of architecture that you touch. You kind of spoke in your beginning that you haven't done any buildings. But then also later in your lectures, you're talking about this, you're comparing and you're making on the signage for the buildings. But I'm wondering if there's like, if you work with people, or somehow your work reflects back onto the architecture, and the signage, or like architecture itself can become the signage, or if you've ever kind of had that level of integration within the architecture realm, or I just think maybe you have some opinions on what that could be or look like.
Well, I mean, I think they're not distinctly different. I mean, signage in a way is the perfect blend of sort of graphic design, architecture, and industrial design. You need to know how to detail. You're dealing with sort of millimeters here, right? And so there are so many other aspects of knowing how to read a plan, understanding space, where people queue, wayfinding, all these other things, sensibilities that as an architect help me every day, especially when it comes to more spatial projects, even if they're signage. And so I think they're not mutually exclusive. It's like a little bit of sort of finding the right scale that is interesting for you to work in, if that makes sense. And I think for me, what I've found, works really well is on these things that are like massively huge, like signage systems that are made of sort of small components, or these very sort of small things that are very discrete, right? And so I don't know if that sort of answers your question, but I think there's a way that you don't need to think, architecture has to be in this way or influence one or the other. You're using those skills all the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I was wondering if you could share a little more about the last project with Lorenzo Piano, the Cultural Center, in terms of that period of final selection. I mean, maybe the interview, I guess. I mean, how difficult was it to win that commission, I guess? And just sort of.
Well, I think, we definitely had a leg up because I had finished doing the Perez Art Museum in Miami with Hertz Art de Miron. I had finished working on sort of Lorenzo Piano on the extension of the Gardner in Boston. And so I had already, and especially when it comes to understanding the Gardner Museum and knowing that museums when you're talking to the people who actually are going to operate them, you know that they are, they are it's the most unglamorous position in a museum. The curator is the most glamorous, and the actual people who run the museum. And so knowing that as a context helped us greatly in sort of being able to say, we know what you need, and we know what you're going to need in the next 6 months because we've seen this at other institutions. And so I do think a certain level of experience there greatly helped us out. And part of the reason is we weren't contracted. We were just contracted to do the logo. There was no brand manual. There was no website. There was no signage. All of those kind of sort of came in time. And so it really comes from building up trust. And part of that trust really comes from knowing the client, but also having experience in those type of situations.
Thank you. It's beautifully done.
Yeah, I mean, it's a project we like a lot, and it's one that, a cultural institute is one that, well, let's be quite honest, they like their white walls. They don't want signage everywhere, right? They often, break all sorts of sort of codes in terms to keep the walls as white as possible. So we knew there was certain areas that we could integrate into the building as much as possible. Other parts that we just had to be as minimal as possible. So there's something really nice about that everything is really loaded on the outside, and everything inside is essentially just vinyl. It's vinyl on glass, vinyl on the walls, etc. But everything else is sort of very bespoke and custom on the outside.
Jeff, Ken here.
Hey, Ken.
How are you? It's really great. Really great to have you participate in this. I'm kind of curious about what the hard parts are. I'm really curious about, where the stumbling blocks are, if there's any pattern to those, where the failures might be, where the abrupt shifts occur, and maybe one or two examples.
In a particular project or in Centro Botín?
It's whatever comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I would say probably the stumbling block is we run a small practice, right? And so running a small practice, you're constantly hustling, right? And Greg had sort of mentioned this sort of buzz is, we're always getting new projects, but we're also, finishing them. And so in that, there's the stumbling block is to try to keep curiosity at kind of an all-time high, I would say. And you realize when you're avoiding burnout, and I think one of the things that we try to do as much as possible in the studio is to make sure that if you are working on a really grueling packaging project that, it's literally like every text is down and it takes months just to get someone from regulatory to approve the French, and you've changed it 800 times, that particular person, is also working on something that is somehow inspiring them, right? And so I do think the stumbling block that I've seen is that when morale is low, when we aren't keeping that level of curiosity, because at the end, as a small office, people want to work with us based on our work, and also based on, that they can do something good here.
How many people do you have are in the office?
We have 5 people.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's not small, but it's not big. It's one person from being too large and one person from being too little.
Are everyone else coming from a graphic design or communications or some sort of design background?
No, we try to keep an even, well, not always, but we try to keep a mix of we have sort of the more spatially minded people that work on sort of the more signage projects. And we have the people who are more sort of graphic designers. And some of, even within that, there are people who are specific to just web, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
So that's kind of sort of also a stumbling block, is trying to make sure you're not spread too thin, but you've got the right cast of characters.
June's here. She had dinner with us too. We both remember trying to find the restaurant and also trying to get back from the restaurant in Beijing. So,
Yeah.
yep. Thanks so much, Jeff.
Great work.
Thank you.
Great work.
Jeff, thank you for an excellent lecture. I enjoyed it very much. I wanted to ask you how you feel about working in another country, not your own, different culture, different language. You've been there long enough to acclimatize. How do you feel when you come back to the States?
I mean, it's a little bit of a shock. You know? At times, you know, but I think it's a little bit of a shock, just because you like, I know my brother-in-law is kind of a very odd story, but my brother-in-law has a birthday on December 24th, and he loves a roller rink, and he lives in rural North Carolina, and we go to this roller rink. And so whenever I come back, it's often around Christmas, and I'm now in the middle of rural North Carolina in a roller rink where they still have the carpets up on the wall, you know, with the same game systems. And so culturally at times, sure, that's not something I'm going to find here in Spain. Right. But that being said, you know, it takes a minute, but you get back into sort of the swing of things. You know, my Southern accent sort of starts to act up, you know, and, you know, I mean, in that way, I've always been kind of a little bit of a chameleon.
Excellent. And you're totally comfortable in Spain with the language, the culture, and everything. You've been there long enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a very kind of honorific I'm the weirdo here. So in a way, it plays to my advantage, I would say, right? So I'm automatically singled out, you know. People want to hear, you know, like, what am I going to say? How is he going to say it? What's the word choice he's going to in Spanish? So there are, I mean, you got to work your disadvantages to your advantages.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff.
No problem.
Jeff, do you have any industrial design projects happening at all? Any prospects for those?
Industrial design, we are doing a little bit more at the moment. We're doing a couple initiatives, and I think our kind of sort of own initiatives, looking into sort of sustainable signage in terms of sort of ADA related, and just a couple other things that are in that sort of smaller scale. We're not sure what we're going to make out of them quite yet, but there are smaller things that we're hoping to launch in the next sort of year or so. I'm not sure if we're going to sell them or what it's going to be exactly. But I do think there's a little bit more sort of on that level. But we're also, oddly enough, doing our first makeup brand. So there's a lot of, I would say, peculiar projects that we kind of sort of have to balance all at once.
Oh, interesting. Good. Any other questions from the audience? This has been terrific. Oh, by the way, Hunter Knight wanted to be here in the Zoom space. He apologizes. He got called to a job site, but hopefully both of you will join us for the next one. So I'm trying to see if we could pyramid and team tag. Yeah, very cool. Well, this has been great. If there's no other questions, thank you, Jeffrey. This is wonderful to see the office and yourself out on your own now, and this is terrific. I wish there were actually a lot more students here. I feel like there's a whole new horizon for students who are interested in design, who are doing architecture, but are not going to do architecture. This is the perfect colloquium for you. So they will have to see it in the recording, but it's great.
For sure.